Welcome everyone back to the J3U podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett, and with me is co-host Luke Miller. Luke, what's up, man?
Not much, man. A long couple weeks of travel and seminars. Now a nice little conversation about one of our favorite body parts to train, huh?
Yeah, today we wanted to talk about quad training, and it was cool. Luke and I just went up to, well, he lives in Dallas. I went up to Dallas and got to be part of the seminar with him, and we talked a lot of actually kind of like quad training, squat mechanics. It's a cool turnout. I had so much fun up there doing that and just talking live with people. So we definitely want to do more of these. So you listeners that just want to come see us live and talk nerd stuff, you'll have to get more involved and check them out. But it was exhausting, man. Like I slept so shit up there. For one, like overthinking everything I had to talk about the next day. So I slept crappy. Then afterwards, I was so excited about all the things that I could do. I slept crappy again and just wake up thinking like, I need to jot this stuff down. And so when I came home, I'm like, I can't wait to get some great sleep. And Renee and I went out, and it was like her celebration for Tampa because she hasn't been able to really do that yet. So we went to all kinds of different restaurants, dude. We found an awesome sushi place that we'll have to go to when you come down. But they had like some high-end rolls, like lobster and truffle oil. Like it's not all you can eat, but it's definitely like you pay for like this high level quality. We found a cookie place, then we went to the Cheesecake Factory, and because there's three we wanted to try, and we did the white chocolate raspberry, the Reese's peanut butter one, and then that Cinnabon one. I think the Cinnabon one actually was the best that we tried. Super sweet. Super sweet though.
Yeah. Like 2 bites and you're done, but
yeah.
Type of next time it'll have to be
another place to try a Detroit style pizza.
Oh my God.
It was like little, like we ordered the little sizes, right? It was like, but it was kind of like cheesy bread pizza. Have you ever had a Detroit style pizza?
No. Is it like thin?
No, it's thick and it's square.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
sounds
in Detroit it came about well, like when they would from like working on cars, and they'd have like pans that would throw like nuts and screws and stuff in. So I guess someone like brought home this like pan from their automotive parts, and that's what they made it out of. This like, it's like almost kind of like a cast iron skillet cook, right? So it's like a thicker bread, and they put cheese all around it, so it like caramelizes and blackens kind of around, and then it's cheese and sauce on top. So it has like kind of a Chicago aspect to it, but it's a very like, it's almost like a French bread type of crust that's really cheesy. It's really good. I still like normal pizza though. That was like a cheese stick to me. So anyway.
I'm a mellow mushroom guy.
We have one down here. I've never tried it. It's good.
We'll make sure that happens post Olympia. Yeah, we'll make sure that happens post Olympia.
But anyway, you and Nick had those Delta 8 THC gummies.
Oh, I didn't, Nick.
Oh, you didn't take one.
I can't do that stuff, man. But Emily does it. Emily will do it. And like one of the big things is like the sleep parameters. We had a chat about this before, is like how much people are improving sleep qualities with that relative to the gummies that are THC derived from like weed. So like indica gummies, like it's very common to see people with like indica gummies. And I'm just finding that anecdotally, like the Delta 8 drives better sleep. And like Nick said the same thing. Emily says the same thing when she has it. So it's interesting. I can't fully mechanistically explain the difference, but
well, there was a store. I was like, oh look, this botanical store. Let's get this gummy and try one. It was like, I thought it was like, I've taken some CBD stuff. I thought it was going to be like, oh, this light relaxation. Like, dude, we were fucking high, like straight high. Like Like it was kicking in. I was like, oh, that's cool. I feel relaxed. By the time we got to like, we took a walk. By the time we got to bed, it was like high to where like if you took a step, all of a sudden you're in the next room. You're like, fuck, like you're just like spacing out. It's just like I was like, I didn't want that. Didn't expect it. I was out cold, fucking cold out, coma, and woke up crazy groggy, and was like that for like until like 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Unproductive in work because I was still like, I think I woke up high. Like it was crazy. Like this stuff it's still like a THC, but it's
Yeah,
just
it,
like whatever. It's like the double bond is in a different carbon versus like it's delta 9 THC is from marijuana, but this one's from hemp, right?
yeah,
Yeah. But anyway, last
yeah.
night a quarter gummy because I'm totally weak, I guess. Whatever, like 6.25 milligrams, and that was good. So I'm actually functional today. I can articulate my words and thoughts. But anyway,
Oh, that's
I
funny.
want to tell you about that. I
Um,
know we are very far away from quad training, but um, anyway, quad training. That was the
yeah,
topic of the day. Kick
let's
us
rock.
off, Luke. Let's get into quad training now.
So 4 quad heads mainly, 5 if you want to go searching down the deep realms of what they found in an anatomical perspective on some individuals, but we'll talk 4 because that's how most people understand it. One of them crosses the hip, right? So when we talk about stretch position versus shortened position, flex hip versus extended knee, fully shortened, then extended hip, bent knee, so flex knee, fully stretched. So we never really see full end range, in my opinion, for a quad on both ends. We get a little bit closer to a shortened end range with the quad extension. Stretch end range, if we're honest with ourselves, is more like a sissy squat. So when we talk about programming squats with end range in mind, it's probably more mid to end range. But I think one of the biggest things we need to lay out first is what are the problems that people typically have when it comes to developing quads, and then build out some solutions in the way that we structure sessions around that, because I think that that's probably going to provide the most value when it comes to actually writing your sessions for quad development.
Yeah, I think just knowing the anatomy can help a lot of people up, and um, where setting up. I think setting up alignment too
Yeah, for
is
sure.
going to be the biggest thing where we're looking at for machines. And I like for people that have weak quads. It's always hey, why are you getting poor activation within that? Is that like part of the problem? Is it just a setup issue? Maybe it's just poor exercise choice. So there's kind of a list that we can go through of why that might be happening in the first place. It's kind of what we
Yeah.
went through in the seminar, right? So like, what is going on with it within the pattern that you're not getting good quad engagement to begin with? Um,
And
is
it's
that
a
where
lot of,
you started with it?
yeah, so I think a lot of it's going to be like capacity based, right? Like, do you have relative internal rotation capacity to fully reach depth without excessive hip extension or having to squat in this A-frame pattern, which is going to shift a lot of tension towards your glutes. Obviously, we can have an argument of whether it loads a stretch glute or not. In that A-frame, it probably doesn't as much as a normal squat stance, but you're relying on the structure of external rotation and hip extension in order to move within these patterns because you lack the function, and as a result probably don't develop quite as much quads. And this is where a lot of times like you'll see people with better glutes who don't have like the best quad development, right? It's because they're
Yeah.
shifting a lot of tension there. And so it might be like a functional assessment to start, like where do you lack, and then build out some ways to improve that over time, but you still have to output within the session first. And so then you start going down the path of building actual connection. And so we kind of touched on this, is like addressing the short end range first to build that proprioception capacity of, oh yeah, that's my quads. Like get it really short while it's fresh, create that neural capacity before we go into the output pattern, and then choose the exercise selection that biases that as well a little bit better than other patterns.
Yeah, I think just speaking on here, it's probably hard for people to assess that functional aspect without like really showing it. So I
Yeah.
think you just have to dive into like the setup,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which prioritizing any body part, it's something that we want to be training first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that next conversation goes like, well, what do you pick for a first exercise? And within that, usually we want look like Luke's saying like parts that movements that we can pick that like for one align well with our structure, and within that alignment, that should also allow us to get like a full range of motion at the knee without compromising other areas of like your lower back rounding or whatever that may be. So we want something that aligns well, that gets us a full range of motion, that is within our ability to do for like bracing. So that's like has been the argument, like should you squat or should you not squat? Well, it depends. If you can brace well for the movement and be able to give the output through your quads, then it's a good movement. If you can't, well, that's an issue to address for one, but then we can have you working in a movement that's more braced until you have the ability to use it, or just make sure you don't have weaknesses within that. And so, and what I mean by that, like, is the back squat a bad movement, or the hack squat? It's like the back squat can be a great exercise if it aligns well for you and you can move through a range of motion that biases the quad. And for some people, it just doesn't. Like if you have someone that's really long femored, or taller guy, or like a short torso, like that might be a very bent over squat that's very hip dominant, erector dominant. So it might not be a great choice. Now you have someone that's built with like short legs, long torso, that squats super upright, and they have a ton of knee flexion. That could be a great quad movement for them. But if that same person can't brace and stabilize the core, and so once they're getting up to a load where that you could get a good output from the quads, that their core crumbles and then they like your butt kicks up and then it not loading the quads as efficiently, or they get injured, well then it's probably not the best movement. We should move them to something like a hack squat or a pendulum squat. So I think regardless, some type of squat pattern is usually a good first choice. And that's then we're trying to determine like which squat pattern, and it's going to be based off of, does it train the intended muscle? What's the range of motion? How does it align with your joints and within your abilities? And then looking at that bracing component. So yeah, within that we have a few options to pick from for squat patterns for quads, right?
Yeah, quite a bit.
And so there's the individual component that you really just have to assess for someone. But I think if I had to give out some like favorites, starting points, because I don't know if the back squat is a starting point. I mean, it could be. I think it's a great assessment point, like our man Nick.
Assessment tool starting point, but not an output starting point for most.
Like arguably, I think I think the pendulum squat is like on the very top of my list from what it provides as far as for one, most of those machines are pretty adjustable on the platform. So you can have, good ankle dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, and it won't be a limiting factor as much. It also is well braced. So hips are back on the pad, shoulders are braced. It's nearly like a leg press, but it's an improved leg press because of the arc that it travels in, which can allow for a lot of knee flexion with someone that if they normally like in a leg press or a hack squat, that might be a really limited component. And then it also, as you go down, The only disadvantage I see is it lets off a little bit at the very, very bottom. However, it can be a good point. Like if you have some issue with being in that bottom stretch position and having poor like end range strength, that it's a good and bad thing, right? Because you want to develop that, but at the same time, it's kind of a safety component too. Like the most compromising position is when you're deep in the hole in a squat. It lets off a little bit load, and that can be kind of a safety component. But then as you come up, it loads pretty heavy mid range, which I think from a hypertrophy aspect, we want to load the muscle the most, get the most tension and produce the most force in that mid range to lengthen range. And so you check off that block with the pendulum. So with the pendulum, you have a movement where you get a large range of motion at the knee. You have it loading, mid range where you want it. It's braced, and you can easily align yourself within it to suit pretty much most structures.
Yep.
So I think that would be the top of my list. I don't know if you have any arguments against that being at the top of the list.
I don't. I would just make the clarification that it's one of the top of the list because of the drop off at the bottom allows you to teach the cueing of foot pressure that's needed to activate the quads in a squat pattern. So like for people who don't have a pendulum, that's going to be like a reverse banded hack is how I'm teaching that, right? Because not every gym has a pendulum squat. And so we're basically looking at mimicking the profile of the pendulum within the hack squat and then trying to address whatever keeps them from hitting depth within like the reverse band, allowing them to access places they haven't been before, plus creating the contraction out of the bottom where shit's more than likely to go wrong, and then progress them from there, right? And so I think the only argument I would make is that the pendulum's the best starting spot, but it's not the spot we should permanently stay.
Yeah, and like with anything, it's not like here's your list. That's what you're going to do for the rest of your life. These movements should be rotated for variety and just repetitive, use aspects. But I think also just to develop like what we were talking about in their seminar about developing full function of all the musculature that is needed to function in the straight line. So like, yeah, at the knee, it just, knee flexion extension, but like we talked about, there's all these other muscles preventing it from rotating around or preventing your knees from caving in or knees from coming out. And that's why we see that happen in those movements that aren't as braced, of that you have weaknesses within that are your rotary muscles that's, controlling internal, external rotation of the knee. You get loaded in the hole and you don't have that component strengthened, and your knee shoots in or it shoots out or whatever it may be, or hips shoot up. And that's when you're like, get injured or like, oh man, this hurts my back, I'm not going to do it. And you move to a pattern where it's easier you don't need as much of that rotary component. So it's easier to stay in the straight line. But at some point, if you get load high enough, those discrepancies will still show up. So you haven't solved the problem. But what Luke is saying is like, these movements where you can decrease load in that area where you see that discrepancy happen, you can work on giving those cues to help someone build that component and just have the proper form doing it. But within that, you still need to be addressing other functions of strength that keep you in those lines. But I think that's important. Like even with the squat, what you said, the cueing, right? So where should pressure be in the squat? Does it just go up and down? So what was your cueing that you used for at least foot pressure in all the squats?
So basically, like it's going to be dependent upon where you're at in the squat, but a lot of times I just teach it out of the hole because people pretty much at the top kind of do it automatically. Like they kind of engage their glutes, they push out, and then they hold that push out all the way down to the bottom, which is where we start getting some of that leaning into the external rotation pretty hard. You're cueing like this screw into the floor type of a thought process. But when we kind of start to approach depth and that internal rotation has to start to kick in, we want to cue like big toe down, as long as big toe down doesn't lift pinky toe on the opposite side. So that's that pronation that allows you to hit depth, because if we constantly cue pushing out, we're actually limiting our subtalar joint from creating dorsiflexion. So you're fighting an uphill battle. So foot pressure for me is like mid-foot. So it shouldn't be driving onto our toes or way back on our heels. Mid-foot and cueing that toe down. And you can typically feel this like progressively more with the more flat foot your shoe is. However, I would proceed with caution because more flat foot will drive more pronation without you trying. So there's a propensity to overpronate. You could cause an injury if you've been training in Jordans, right? So that big toe is the foot pressure cue that I typically use that typically people click with.
That's a transition in the movement pattern.
Yeah.
Right? So at the top of the movement, you kind of have equal foot pressure for the most part between like heel, pinky toe, big toe. As you're squatting, you start off the squat with this slight like external rotation, contracting the glutes. That brings you down closer to depth, but that last few inches is this slight component where you're rolling the foot a little bit more pressure onto your big toe. So out of the hole, that should be the foot pressure you feel. Heel, pinky toes there, but a good increase in pressure to the big toe.
Yeah, which is why I was saying I cue that more than the other, because most people come off a rack or come off a hack and they immediately go out with their foot pressure, right? So typically people do the first 3/4 of the movement or first half of the movement or wherever pretty well, and then it's just learning that transition.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's a complicated way to like have to think about all that shit while you're lifting, and so most people don't. So I think just having like the one cue is helpful, but it's important like to address that because of why you're setting up a reverse hack in the first place, right? And
yeah,
if you're seeing people with those issues, it can help them coordinate that a little bit easier without having such a dynamic lift. But if we're getting back to like the output side,
for sure,
I see everyone using like a reverse band along everything, but then a lot on the hack, and that's just become like that's the best way to set up the hack. And arguably, I would say that's not the best way to set up the hack, because I think the reverse band you actually would be producing. For one, there's less load in the bottom, and so we know like the muscle at close to full length has the greatest potential to produce force. So you're now, and it's at its strongest point. So at the strongest point, where you have the greatest ability to generate force, you're decreasing the load the most. So it's kind of the opposite of what you really want. Now, arguably, you're trying to match the strength curve, right? Well, when I get stuck in the hack on free weight, it's not right out of the bottom ever. It's always kind of mid range is where that sticking point is. So you're still like, if anything, you'd want to set up that band to maybe where it just catches a little bit. But still, I don't think that's the best way. I would argue just do free weight or set a band from the bottom, pulling the weight stack down. So at least it's not like, storing that potential energy within the band and shooting you out of the hole. And so you can use the momentum from the band to keep lifting. I would say doing the opposite could be a much more challenging way and have to produce a ton of force that way. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I would go with the no band as the best option for output because it's the purpose of programming a squat is addressing mid to lengthened.
Yeah.
And like that's just the setup that's going to allow for that the best, right? And then from there, like if you want to get output matching a strength curve, band your leg press after you squat, right? And that's kind of the setup I run right now is a banded. So the way you said, like attaching from the bottom, I squat and then I do a banded leg press.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like the idea of trying to like match the strength profile and resistance profile of the hack is like you're really trying to overload at the very top once you get past that sticking point, which at that point you're getting to a point where you're really like starting to stack joints and getting mechanical advantage. I think just going to a movement that just loads that part of the range a a little bit more efficiently would probably be your best bet, rather than making the hack less efficient. So if you
Yeah.
really want to load like the shortened phase of the quad, it's like just go do a set of leg extensions at the end of your workout. I think that would cover that ground for you well. Or it's the leg press, which I want to hit all of our squats first before we jump to leg press. So we'll get back to leg press, but there's another like squat I like wanted to bring up, because you brought up hack squat, because a lot of people will have hack squats, right? If you don't, because the pendulum is the more rare find.
Yep.
But a lot of people might not even have a hack squat, or now they might just have their garage gyms. So I think an actual squat pattern, or even out of a Smith squat, would be a good choice. And I think setting it up to where you have a quad emphasis and would be the best option. So I would think probably a slight heel elevated. So maybe like, a 1 inch, maybe 2 inch max with a safety squat bar
Mm-hmm.
would probably be other top of the list if we needed a free weight squat.
I would agree.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to say something you're going to have to disagree sometime.
I think it also depends on how someone moves with a safety bar, right? Only reason I tend to say safety bar for our population is because they typically positionally stay a bit better in under a safety bar. Like dropping into the hole, they stay in a little bit of a positionally better spot. But I know some people who high bar better than they safety bar. And in that case, it's like, just high bar. That's your best bet, right? So I would say they're almost equals depending on how you move within the pattern. I would argue most of the people that are listening to this conversation probably don't move in a high bar very well. So safety bar is probably the way to go with that slight heel elevation.
Yeah, I think just getting under the bar for a lot of us bodybuilders, like the shoulder mobility aspect, it just, oh man, it cranks. Yeah. And then you like push day, right?
Yeah, and like from a programming perspective, like if you have someone who has weak quads and then weak push body parts, like that's net loading a squat bar
Yeah.
on the joint. Like I don't care how you right, it's not active training of the shoulder joint, but it's net stress on the shoulder joint. It's going to take away from your capacity to output and or drive that vector up. So this is why you'll see like I'll commonly try to like in phases where I'm driving pressy very heavily, I'll try to avoid the need to use that a lot. So it'll be like, so like one of the reasons I'm using the Smith is because I can do like a soft position,
Yeah.
right? Like I don't have to crank that elbow. I can just kind of let it sit there, right? And obviously like ideally I'd be cranking it a little bit, which I do to create that lat pressure,
Yeah.
but I'm not having to stabilize the free bar. So net systemic on me is a lot less. And there's some other things too, but safety bar is probably your best bet from not affecting your other sessions as well, as far as like net systemic stress on like your net local stress on your shoulder complex.
Right. I think even with the Smith, you could use like wrist straps and loop them on the bar, and then just grab the strap in front of you. Of course, you need someone to unhook it and hook the Smith for you. But if you can't get under the bar, that could be an option. I think there's also something called a man array that snaps.
Attachment.
Yeah, it snaps on the bar just to make it high bar. And then there's even another attachment to turn a Smith into like a safety squat. Like it just has handles, right? So you can rotate the handles. I saw something like that. So that's some options. Like if you just need a little investment in yourself and bring something to the gym, that could be a simple thing to throw in the gym bag. But the only other thing that I've had issues with the safety squat bar is it tends to want to pull you forward and go into thoracic like flexion. So you like thoracic extensor muscles can get worked pretty hard. And so I guess it depends on programming that. Like if like back is something you really need a lot of, and depending where your pull day is, it might tax you a lot for that. So it's just a consideration programming across the whole week. But But with all those things like being considered, I think it's still like that thought process of like just making sure you're using the bar apparatus you need to make it quad focused. You get a large range of motion at the knee, not a lot of hip pushback. You can stay upright with the core braced. If you can do those things, then you'll have a good setup. Um, within the squat itself, as far as like foot position goes, toes in, out. As far as like what I've heard people like say, hey, if you go wider or narrower, like you'll work more of like the lateralis, or how do I get more quad sweep squatting? And as far as like at least even EMG study that I've looked at, like foot, like toe positioning within the squat doesn't matter for different quad activations of the heads. All that matters is you bend the knee as much as you possibly can through that range of motion. Whether the toes are straight forward or slightly out, it won't matter. Going wide stance or narrow stance, it won't make a big difference, but it does, because if you're wide stance, you might not get as much knee flexion. And so that's the limitation there. So pick the stance in the foot position that allows you to move through the full range of motion at the knee. That would be
Yep.
my advice on it.
I would agree with that 100%.
So those are some squat patterns. So I'd say like, hey, quad day, pick a squat pattern that fits with all this criteria that Luke and I laid out. And you probably want to rotate those squat patterns, which you don't need to do it every other week. You could run a mesocycle of 6 weeks of one, then rotate to the next squat pattern. As long as you're rotating in some manner, I think that makes a lot of sense. I like rotating less often if you're a beginner, so you can build some efficiency in those movements. And then as you get more advanced, it makes a lot more sense, I think, to rotate more frequently. But anyway, so number one, we have our squat. Then from there, we have some more juice left in the tank. Ideally, we talked about like how many exercises should you even have? And it should be enough to train the quad through every aspect that it can function through, right? So really, you could just do a squat, probably a leg press or leg extension, and that would cover mostly everything. I know some people say you wouldn't even need a leg extension because you're going to get some rec fem work in some of your other movements.
Yep.
But to fully eke it out, you might do a leg extension.
I think it's good to get into that fully shortened though for rec fem, like hip flexed and knee extended, because there's not one where you're really going to be doing that and challenging it, right? Like you could, because positionally, like it's similar to the top of a leg press, right? Flex because of the seat pad, but leg straight, but you're stacked joint, so you're not challenging the muscles. I would make the argument that quad extension squat pattern and always be in there, and then your leg press is just based on where can you output the most, get into the best position, and neurally connect with your quads to create an internal stimulus, which is where like leg press now becomes a very flexible movement choice. And so it's like you have someone that has access to a Cybex squat press with long pegs, like that's a pretty good option because of the way it moves. It typically allows for people to hit depth pretty easy.
Yeah.
Standard 45, you can always adjust according to someone's movement capacity. You can always band it as well in order to allow someone to hit depth, as that's where they're having issues getting access or control, which we could probably get into whether banded or non-banded leg press is a good idea here. And then I know you like the pendulum.
Yeah. It's I'll rotate around. My thing with the pendulum is getting in it.
It's a bitch.
It is. And then to get in it and still, you kind of lose a little bit of range. You can, once the loading gets high enough, because it's starting from the bottom position. So you get down and then it's, and as you push up, it loads more of the shortened end of the muscle. So, I mean, it kind of meets that criteria of what you're getting out of a leg extension. So, I mean, that's an option, but I think to mimic that, and the pattern's kind of nice too, because it arches and it can easily get you more range of motion at the knee that way.
Yeah. I think the best variation of the horizontal leg press is the Rogers hip press, though,
Okay.
because it's the mid rack. So you rack it mid rep. And so it's like a leg press where you unrack it and then you go into the rep.
I've never used one, so I don't know.
Game changer.
Oh shit.
It'll be like if I ever build a facility, it'll be the first piece I buy.
Damn. It's that good. Yeah, we need to tell Roland then, hey, we need to get this. I need to go try one. Where we have, I think there's one in New Braunfels that's at some gym up there.
So when it comes to like the leg press, like I'm looking more for where does these people move the best in, and then picking that leg press pattern according to that, because we've probably mostly addressed everything we need to address within quad extension and squat.
Yeah, I think same idea. If you can for one, you're going to be why go leg press second? It's like you're moving from a pattern that requires a lot of bracing, has a lot of systemic fatigue that it creates. And so you could be a little bit more taxed. So we're now moving into a more stabilized position. So you can brace the core easier. It's basically not going to move. You're only going to be moving at the hips and knee joints. So it's much safer aspect to go to. But I think from most people will have like a 40 or 45 degree leg press, which you see people that unrack it at the very top. They're just like, it's like quarter reps, you're not going down much, and you can use a ton of weight. So that should tell you right now, like at the very top of the leg press, you're very, very strong, because joints are getting closer to be stacked, and it's a mechanical advantage. So that's the idea of why I would use a band on the leg press, because to match that profile. So it'll be harder out of the bottom, and then as you get to the top, it'll get easier. So you can use that with a band to try to match that to where it's, from the bottom to the top, it's just as hard. And so you can make each rep as effective in tension across the span of the active contractile range. And arguably, do you need it? Does it make it that much better? I don't know. It's hard to say, honestly. We don't have a ton of research to say. We have a few studies. But I think once you get to the advanced level, and like every rep matters, and we only have so many sets in our arsenal to do, and to make each one as much as possible out of every rep, I think it will matter. For like a beginner or something, I don't think you need to band your leg press. Like just doing them is going to be plenty of stimulus, but reaching up into that high intermediate advanced level where like, hey, one rep on a set is going to make a difference if we're getting a good growth stimulus or not. I think maximizing those avenues is what we should be doing. We won't have research on it because to put together like 10 high level bodybuilders and have them do something like this, it's just not going to happen. But anecdotally, we've seen guys that are very, very big, very, very strong, and they're using these approaches and they're progressing. So I'll weigh into that evidence and lean into it. It also makes a lot of sense just logically. So
yeah, because you're now taking the opportunity to get the most output out of the pattern by matching closer strength curve to resistance profile once we've addressed kind of end ranges, especially like the mid to lengthened end range that the squat pattern addresses, right?
Right on.
So
that hits the short end of the muscle pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. So sequencing wise, like that starts to get into building a session. We mentioned one where it's like quad extension first because you just can't feel your quads. I think there's a lot of ways to build out the session structure for quad training depending on the person. So a couple explanations, like just to kind of lay out some frameworks for people, I think is a smart idea. You kind of touched on the why squat before leg press perfectly. Don't think anything needs to be said there.
No, should I touch leg extension just so it's included within what you're going to like completely?
Yeah, go ahead.
Here?
Yeah, let's go ahead with
it. So like after like the squat, you need to eke out more out of your quads. So you go to your leg press, and then you've eked out everything you can out of your leg press, and then you still need, maybe at that point you still need some type of further volume to continue growing quads and need more stimulus, but you now you like have already have a little bit of fatigue. So we now can move to our isolation exercise, which would be where a leg extension would fit well.
Yep.
We can also, like, we know hypertrophy rep range wise, like, probably staying within that 6 to 12 reps is where we want a lot of our work. And those, like, your squat caters well to that. I think your leg press moves up a little bit, 12 to 15 reps probably. And then your leg extension, you could get into even the higher rep ranges, which we know are really good for hypertrophy. Also, high rep ranges is, I think, cater well versus doing like a 20 rep set on a squat versus a leg extension is a lot different thing. And then we can also take advantage of probably some other areas, whether they're just side effects of mechanical tension or they're actually drivers of hypertrophy within themselves, of trying to get like some metabolic stress, cell swelling, and take that avenue for hypertrophy, or we just want to fucking pump, But anyway, the leg extension would be next because we can train the muscle fully shortened. It's not the best movement as a first exercise because we are only training the movement fully shortened, and we know training more mid-range lengthen is your best for force production and also hypertrophy. But I've seen some, like, at least it's just EMG research on like looking at the rectus femoris in the squat, in the leg press, and it doesn't get activated nearly as much as just doing like a leg extension. So with the leg extension, you can get, I think, more rectus femoris out of it, utilizing it. So it kind of does tie in the full quad development.
I would agree.
And I think just, as far as setup within it, at least in my issue with like adductors and how I kind of normally, like, I'm kind of externally rotated anyway all the time, is I'll align myself single leg in it to where I can align up my knee, ankle, and hip to where I don't have this like external rotation as I'm coming up in the leg extension. And because some people get some knee pain. I think a lot of that is that, for one, you need to align the knee joint with where the pivot point is on the leg extension.
Yep.
And as far as where the ankle pad is set up, I don't think that matters quite as much because it's just on the tibia anyway. But as far as when you're moving to the top of the squat, your top of your patella should be pointing up and not out, because otherwise it would be kind of binding at the knee. So I align myself in the leg extension to have that set up to prevent like the knee pain and stuff that can be going on. If you have any other tips, or you disagree with that or agree, or
I agree. I think what people miss out on is like laying back, not realizing that this pulling your chest up, kicking back in the seat is not only creating leverage, but creating rotation where you start to catch a lot of that knee pain as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So like finding that counter force and pulling it down and forward to lock that position will actually kind of help you keep that patella in a straighter alignment as well. For those of us that don't have John Jewett adductors, can probably get into a two-legged or a bilateral position where you can align it pretty well. And the last portion would just be dorsiflexing while performing the quad extension as like the last piece.
Explain that.
Explain the dorsiflexion?
Yeah. Why? Why?
Because it's going to like, that's the position. I do it from like a gait cycle perspective, because we should be in the dorsiflex position when we pull up into what's called a sprinter pose. And you'll see people who lack dorsiflexion do that in the quad extension. It's like, I'm the prime example of this. I can't fully dorsiflex when I do a quad extension, but that's because I lack ankle mobility. And so we should be driving that dorsiflexion while in that quad extension pattern.
I was thinking of it as like a stabilization component throughout the knee and ankle.
Yeah, because you're
like, if you're, I didn't know if that's what you meant by it, or it was, you had there was like this something that increased quad activation by like kicking your feet up or something. I don't know. But yeah, I guess I could see that. As far as like, if you're all limp ankle and you're like, maybe like it would increase just like stability doing it. But I think the last thing that people might end with was like, hey, I do lunges at the end of my workout. Um, which the difference between a squat and a lunge is that it pretty much is the same thing in a sense, as far
Yeah.
as like the front leg working quad, if this is our focus.
Yes.
Um, positioning wise, you can shift around just like you can on a squat to hit different aspects. Of course, in a lunge, you do have like that back leg coming back, which could train more of the rec fem in the lengthened state, which
Mm-hmm.
is an area that if you need like rec fem development, is an aspect that we're not training with these other movements. So I think it's important to get into. I think where you get into it is also important consideration. So if you're doing lunges at the very, very end of your workout, you're moving to a more complex movement that requires a lot of bracing, and the output is going to be more challenging because of that bracing and lack of stability when you already don't have great bracing stability being so fatigued. That's probably not the best place to put your lunge. Um, a lunge doing first, well, I still don't know if that's a great hypertrophy aspect because of the other reasons I mentioned. I think the lunge has its place in trying to train the function of like what we've talked about. If you're having like knee travel in or out, or more of a functional aspect, um, or if you wanted something like that, it needs, I would think, having it more braced. So like a split squat in the Smith machine where you can like have some good bracing throughout. Or maybe it's a Bulgarian split squat where you have a dumbbell and you can grab a rack, and that way everything is a little bit more braced, and maybe you're staying in the higher rep range as well, so the loading component is as high. That could be something better than like a walking lunge at the end of the workout. Um, so yeah, I think you do it that way. I think you could do like a squat pattern, then maybe you could do some type of like Bulgarian split squat, and maybe you don't have a leg press, right? And so you do it that way. Could be a way to move through it. But I said, don't have a lot of lunge work in my programming because of those reasons. But I think it's something that we should get into just to train the unilateral aspect and also train that rec fem getting back and into hip extension with a little bit of knee flexion. But
Yeah, I would agree. I think the walking lunge is more of a tester, or I'm trying to specifically drive some sort of functional adaptation. Then I would go split squat as your next best opportunity to train output single leg, and then single leg press as your highest opportunity to train output in a single leg. But you don't get the stretch of the rec fem on the back end with a single leg press. That's the only downfall. So output purposes of a split squat, if that's the goal, the framework of the split squat, I would argue, barring there's no issues, rear foot elevated, moderate heel elevation, safety bar squat in a rack, hanging onto the rack.
okay, yeah, I can see it. That's a lot of shit to set up to do that.
So
Yeah, I
at
just
that point, I'm probably, if I want that much output, I'm just going to single leg press instead of setting all that up. Like,
yeah,
let's,
that back
but
leg. I've done this, and I tore both my rec fems using
yeah,
a split squat as an output movement, because it's so complex to do, and I think it's too complex to carry into the higher ends of loading and output, and you just shouldn't go there with it. I don't think that's a great purpose from what we're doing in bodybuilding.
I agree. But like, that would be the setup if we were setting up a split squat for
Yeah,
output purposes.
you had
But
no other choice.
yeah, like there's no leg press and you got a single leg output. Like that's what I'm doing. Right.
Yeah, yeah. I think you could even argue it as like if you had maybe some type of development discrepancy, but I still
Yeah.
think there's a lot more to talk about there. But you could do like, hey, do the weak leg first and do the other one. But this wouldn't be something that you're taking, because within that you need to take it like sub maximal effort levels to make sure these discrepancies aren't causing like compensations. But anyway, that's like a rabbit hole. So let's get to our wrap up of going through these movements and how you would lay them out, because you were about to say that, then we went like leg extension and but I think that covered pretty much the exercise that and why we would choose the ones we choose. So
Yeah. So ideal scenario is I'm probably, honestly, most people lack hamstrings that lack quads. So ideal scenario session setup is some type of hamstring curl into a squat pattern, into a leg press, finishing with a quad extension.
Yeah.
If they need to load a stretch position of somewhere around the hip complex in order to access depth, but they don't have any pain and they connect well with their quads, I'm probably loading an adductor first. So eccentrically loading an adductor in order to gain that end range access, and then squatting. I know Nick does this a lot as well, or you could possibly eccentrically load some of those things around the hip complex in a preparatory fashion instead of doing like actual working set work with it as like secondary, and then
I
tertiary.
was going to ask you that because if you think doing like failure sets on an adduction machine when the adductors have so much role in like hip
Oh, it's
extension out of the
yeah.
whole of a squat, that it's going to limit your squat or your stability component at the knee.
I would argue that yes, it would, which is why I tend to load stretch in a preparatory fashion.
Yeah.
Cossack squat, get the adductor loaded into these stretch positions, split squat for rec fem, things along those lines within prep, a couple
Yeah.
other things. And then still follow the same session structure of ham curl to squat. And then pain, so need to lower output on the squat pattern because of pain, or need to teach someone how to contract a squat or contract a quad, is quad extension first for me.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that can still be done in like a preparatory activation standpoint if you're worried about decreasing force output in your squat, because it's not with the idea of like if you pre-fatigue quads, you might limit your loading in the squat, the external loading. However, if you have a squat pattern that you go into and you're like, I can't feel my quad a lot, feel a lot of like glutes, like that might help you within that. Maybe even having some of that pre-fatigue there. But it goes back to our conversation. If you're picking a squat where you don't get a lot of quad anyway, well, we should probably make sure you have a good squat setup in the first place. But
Yep.
I think where that comes in is like, hey, we found the best squat pattern for you, and you still don't get a lot of quad out of it. Then maybe we should have a leg extension done first.
100%.
Or it might even be that leg press could be done first in the higher rep range because we load the shortened. And then you also have a movement where you can get some high output into. But I would want to make sure your squat pattern would be also kind of braced after that too.
Yep.
Um, but ideally, I agree. I think it's going like having prep work that sets you up to squat, and then from there we move to a more brace like leg press position. And then from there we like just finish it off everything we got with a leg extension.
Mm-hmm.
And like Luke said, like leg curling first, like no one, there's no one around that has like bigger hamstrings than quads. Like I'm yet to see it. Like their hamstrings are just that fucking good. So for one, it's an easy way just to train hams, but I don't have any other good explanation of why it's just makes the squat feel better. I don't know if it's like, hey, you pump your hams up and you just like, provides some like ham to calf, or if there's something within like ACL stability. I have no clue. I don't know. Do you have anything?
I would argue that it would pull blood to the adductor a little bit, just because of, especially if you're cueing internal rotation within the leg curl,
Yeah.
you'd catch some adductor magnus there. And so possibly that could be why you're gaining a little bit of access without driving a lot of adductor fatigue with like direct adductor work. Maybe
Yeah.
that's
I don't know.
that.
I'll,
I think if you did unilateral legs, like lying single leg, it would be even more adductor because we're having to stabilize the pelvis. But
yeah.
um, yeah, other than that, I don't really have a good explanation.
No, that's okay. I think the best one is that people always need hamstrings, so put it first, and it's not taxing. It's not an RDL, and then go into your squat patterns.
Yeah.
Credit to John Meadows. So we give a shout out there because that I read that article on T Nation
Same.
years ago, and he said leg curl first because hamstrings suck on everyone, but also it makes your knees feel better when you squat. And he had no explanation. He said that. He's like, I don't have any science, but just I've coached so many people, and that's what everyone says. So that was good enough for me. And I like to listen to people that have lifted for like 20 plus years on what they have to say to keep lifting for another 20 years. So that's why I still program it in. But anyway, I think no, I think that gives a great framework for quad training and talking through it. So I think we covered it well, man.
That's 100% and tangible things to take away and go use for people as well.
No, for sure. All right, guys. I hope y'all enjoy these quad training and hypertrophy ones. I know everyone wants us to like go through every body part, and we eventually will. So if there's like a real standout body part that y'all want to have us hit next, leave it in the comments. If you're listening to this on YouTube, if you're on like Spotify or iTunes or something, go to YouTube and you can put it in this description, and we'll maybe take all those votes and tally them, and we'll have a precise counting system that will tell us which one that we'll hit next. But anyway, thanks guys for listening, tuning in, and we will talk to you next time.